with the Mexico Institute and with CIDE in Mexico. Much is known about the opinions of Latin Americans towards democracy in their countries since the days of the Latino Barometer polls and also the Americas Barometer. We know a great deal about what citizens in Latin America view about various aspects of democratic governance in their countries. CIDE has undertaken one of the very first studies that I know of, in fact it may be the very first study, of foreign policy attitudes in 4 different countries, Peru, Mexico, Chile, and Colombia. Thank you. This is, I think, going to be very, very revealing in an increasingly globalized world, and in a world in which the opinions of citizens ought rightly to have a role in the foreign policies of democracies. So I thank Guadalupe for launching this study and for breaking new ground in this important area.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. It's an honor, a pleasure for me to be here this morning. The Woodrow Wilson Center has always opened its gates for us for this kind of discussion. I hope you will find the study interesting. 4 years ago, CIDE started asking itself what people, normal citizens, think about foreign policy and foreign affairs. Which is an issue area traditionally reserved to experts. And we thought that after the transition of democratic transition in Mexico, it would be important to start giving voice to public opinion on issues that usually everybody thought they didn't care a lot. So we designed a biennial survey, and this survey is done not only at public opinion level, but also we wanted to look at leaders. So we designed 2 samples in order to see whether there are gaps or not between the public and leaders. And now, 4 years after our first survey, we had been able to include other countries, other Latin American countries, Colombia, Chile, and Peru, and we are starting to including other countries. Next year, we are going to have the survey in Guatemala, Brazil, Argentina, and Venezuela. I hope this is going to work well. And the idea is that in a few years ahead, we could have the whole continent doing this survey every 2 years. This is a unique research project in the way it has been designed and the purpose it serves. The main purpose is to provide relevant actors, decision makers, with reliable information on public attitudes toward international affairs. This is a network of academic and research institutions. I would like to thank all my Latin American colleagues. And part of the idea is to strengthen our knowledge on Latin America in this issue area where we have very little hard data. I think it is also the first study that specializes on the analysis of foreign policy and international affairs, and it focuses on long-term attitudes rather than opinions on a specific current event. So we can pose the same question for a long time ahead. And there is another characteristic of the study. Everybody has free access to the database because we really want to provide a public good, and knowledge is a public good. The structure of the study, it measures attitudes and opinions from 69 different questions and topics, and 18 socio-demographic variables, 10 issue areas, interest on world affairs, contact, knowledge, identity, threats and security, rules of the international game, foreign policy activism and objectives, relations with Latin America, North America, and relations with other countries and regions. I think the importance of the study relates to the fact that it stimulates an informed and balanced public debate on foreign affairs, foreign policy, and inter-American relations. It is also a myth-breaking, reliable data in different countries where misperceptions prevail and sometimes create problems for communication across countries. Just very few things about methodology. The survey has a national representative sample plus a leader sample of 338 individuals that we defined as Mexican elites in 5 sectors: government, politicians, business, mass media, academic and civil society, and NGOs. These are for the public face-to-face interviews. In Mexico, the sample is 2,400 adults. In other countries, 1,500 interviews. And the field work, and this is important for you to know, was from August till November in 2008. So you are going to. I'm really very interested in knowing your reaction about the data. This is a very critical time for inter-American relations, and we really hope to give reliable information to decision makers for a more informed public debate on international affairs. Thank you. I'm going to ask Armand if you could come here to.
Why don't we invite the members of the first panel to come and join us? Thank you.
Yo creo que no, yo creo que si quedara a lo mejor. Sí, hay muy poquito. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. You will look at it.
Okay. Tienes que ir a las 10:15, ¿verdad? No te preocupes. Gracias. Puedes hacer la presentación máximo de 20 minutos para hacerlo lo más eficiente posible. Lo agradezco.
Well, why don't we get started since we don't have a lot of time, and I'd like to keep the train running on time here. Good morning, everybody. My name is Armand Pichard. I've been invited to moderate this morning's session on entitled Mexico Disillusioned with North America, ? For me, it's obviously a pleasure to be here with friends. I'm embarrassed with Jorge because he has to come up to Washington to see me. Every time that I'm in Mexico, I'm always so busy we don't have an opportunity to see each other. And with Bob Pastor and Francisco. It's an interesting issue that they asked me to moderate this panel because I encapsulate, I think, North America. And I wouldn't be a good person to interview for this questionnaire because I was born in Mexico, lived in Mexico, lived in Canada, lived in the U.S., and so I don't know that my answers would be truly representative of any of the 3 countries because I'm very fond of all 3. To start off, we're going to ask Jorge Scavone to open up the session. You all have the bios in front. Jorge is obviously a highly regarded academic in Mexico that has focused for many years on North American issues and international issues. And I'm delighted, Jorge, that you're here, and I won't waste any more time and I'll let you get started with your presentation.
Thank you, Armand, and thank you also, Cynthia, and also thank you, Andrew, for all the generosity and hospitality to inviting us here again to the Woodrow Wilson Center. What I'll do is I'll talk for the next 20 minutes on the most important findings of the survey, because we're more interested in hearing about the comments, because you already have the reports out there, and you can also download all the information from the website. So I'll go as fast as possible, and I'll try to do it in less than 20 minutes. So the first thing I will do, if this starts working, it is. Guadalupe has already told us that this is the third survey. We conducted one in 2004, another one in 2006, and 2008. All this information is already been told by Guadalupe. What I'd like to say is that we have 69 questions and 18 socio-demographic questions. And in this presentation, I will obviously have to concentrate in a small number of them. First, the interesting news about Mexico's relations with other countries is being less and less throughout the years. What we see is that Mexicans are less interested in the world. And if we see this in a time frame, we'll see that both leaders and at the national level, there is a self-introspection. That is, people are more concentrated now in domestic problems and are far away from what's happening in the international system, because mostly they feel the domestic problems more close to them and they don't see solutions for these problems at the international system. And what you can see, however, is that there's no much difference between the interest in international affairs and the interest between other issue areas. What we see is that there is a decrease in the interest in news in all issue areas, not only international affairs, but also social, economic, and political issues in the case of Mexico. And what we also see, at least in the last three surveys, is that there is a reduced contact with the Mexican public and the world. What you can see here is that approximately 70% of Mexicans have never traveled outside from the U.S., and however, our leaders, approximately 70% of them have traveled more than 10 times outside of the country. So this is one of the things that we will continue to see throughout the survey, that there is a gap between what the public feels about international affairs and what leaders feel about international affairs, and I'll show you throughout the presentation how this has happened. What we see is that probably the reason why people are more introspective is because they think that the world is going in the wrong way. That is, the world is worse than 10 years ago, and it will be worse 10 years from now. So there is a pessimism in the Mexican population regarding what's going on in the international system. And you can see that the things that Mexicans perceive as the biggest threats are those concentrated in areas, and over 70% of all Mexicans think that drug trafficking and organized crime, global warming, AIDS, poverty, and food scarcity are those issues in which they believe are the most important and most grave threats to their own living standards. And as you can see at the middle of the table, we have the traditional international security questions, that is, nuclear weapons, international terrorism, and those things in which Mexicans don't think that it's a real threat are populist leaderships and China becoming a world power. Now, in terms of Mexican identity, what we can see is that still being a Mexican is more important than being part from your local state or town where you live. However, what we see is that there's a huge difference between regions in Mexico. That is, if you see that the north, approximately 40-something% of people consider themselves more from the state than from being Mexican. In the center, it is a little bit smaller. However, in the south of the country, more than 64% of Mexicans consider themselves first as being from their state, that is, being from Oaxaca, being from Yucatan, etc., instead of being Mexican. And as you can see, leaders feel more Mexican than anyone else in the country. And what we see is that throughout time, at least in the three surveys that we've done, is that there is an increasing local identity, both in the north, south, and center of the country, and also amongst the leaders. What you see is there is a decreasing sense of Mexican nationality. Now, in terms of regional identity, what you see is that Mexicans feel more Latin American than North American. And again, we see some variation amongst the different regions. However, even if we feel more Latin American than North American, we think that the dissemination of ideas and costumes of other countries in Mexico is a good thing. That is approximately 50% of all Mexicans, and 80% of all leaders think that cultural interaction is good for the country. However, even if we're open to the ideas and cultures from other parts of the world, we do believe that as Mexico, there is no one else. That is, there are Mexicans of first class and Mexicans of second class, according to the Mexican population. What you can see is if you ask Mexicans that if they believe that foreigners which have nationalized as Mexicans should have the same rights as normal Mexicans, to put it some way, you see that approximately at the national level, 30-something% think that they could be elected to Congress, and even playing in the national soccer team, only 30-something% of the population would accept it. And again, you see that there's regional variation between the different regions of the country. The more you are to the north, the more open you are to granting these rights. The more to the south you are, the least you will grant these rights. And this is for nationalized foreigners. When you see dual nationality, things get even worse. A person who has double nationality, that is, he's Mexican and he's American at the same time, only around 20% of the Mexican population think they could be elected to Congress, and less than 20% think that they could run for president. That is, even if they should have the same rights according to the Mexican Constitution, still we think that they're Mexicans of first and second class. There you see Mexican nationalism is still well alive. And now, turning to another issue area in terms of international activism, as you can see, there is a strong support for international activism of Mexico in world affairs. 69% of the population and 93% of the leaders think that Mexico should be very active in world affairs. However, what we see is that when you ask them to rate the agreement with the performance in foreign policy, what we see is in the course of the last 2 years that in leaders, there has been a dramatic increase in terms of those who agree and those who, in leaders, those who agree and strongly and those who agree moderately in terms of Mexican foreign policy amongst the leaders. However, exactly the opposite happens with the population. And what you see is increasing disagreement on Mexican foreign policy conduction by the population. And once again, we have this gap between leaders and general population. And even if we want to be extremely active in world affairs, we don't want to have to pay the cost of being active. That is, when you ask Mexicans if we should abide by international treaties over national legislation, against what the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties says, Mexicans believe that Mexican law is above international law. And also that we should only accept decisions of the United Nations just when we like them. When we don't like them, we shouldn't. And you can see here that we disagree in a majority in terms of not accepting United Nations decisions if we don't like them. And at the same time, we do believe that Mexican law is higher and more important than international law. However, as you can see, leaders are on the other end of the spectrum once again. And in terms of multilateral activities, we also see gaps between publics and leaders in terms of peacekeeping operations of the Security Council of the United Nations. As you can see, the majority of Mexicans, 60%, believe that Mexico should participate in peacekeeping. However, leaders, approximately 60% against like 58%, believe we shouldn't. And in terms of using the force at the United Nations Security Council for intervention in case of human rights violations and genocide, we see that the Mexican population is accepting an active role of the Security Council in terms of these activities in a multilateral way. And here there's agreement between the population and the leaders. And in terms of Latin America, as we said, there was pessimism in terms of world affairs. However, we think that Latin America is not doing so bad. That is, there is optimism in how the region is, has been in the last 10 years and will be in the next 10 years. However, Mexicans have not decided which role they should take in Latin American affairs. We don't know if we should be leaders, around 40%, or if we should participate without being leaders, trying to be leaders in Latin American affairs. And at the same time, we haven't decided what we should do in terms of our natural area of influence, which is Central America. That is, should we be more generous and give money for should we channel economic funds to developing economies in Central America? As you can see, Mexicans haven't agreed on this either. There's limited generosity in terms of what Mexico should try to do in terms of economic support to less developed countries, especially those in Central America. And also, in terms of what we should do with illegal immigration from Central America to Mexico, there is approximately 1/3 of the population that thinks that we should establish controls, such as a border patrol in the southern part of Mexico. However, approximately 45% of the population and approximately 60% of the leaders think that we should establish temporary worker programs for this Central American migrants. Now, in terms of our love for the world, we can see, if you ask Mexicans to rate their affinity with different countries around the world, and where 100 is absolute love, 0 is I hate you, and 50 is neutrality, what you can see is that Mexican affinity is not the highest with Latin American countries. On the contrary, our affinity is higher with those developed countries which have been successful in economic terms, and especially with Canada, Spain, Germany, even China. The first Latin American country that appears is Brazil with 64 points. And going specifically with the case of the U.S., what we've seen in the course of the last years is a decreasing affinity vis-a-vis the U.S. There's a drop of 12 points from 74 to 62 points from 2006 to 2008, and 6 places from being the second place of the highest affinity for Mexicans, the U.S., going all the way to the 7th place. I still have 7 minutes. Okay. And also, Mexico, even if we feel we're more Latin American, and therefore you ask Mexicans whether they think Mexico is more part of Latin America or of North America, again, a vast majority of over 55% of the population and over 60% of leaders think we are Latin American. However, we are pragmatic, because in terms of economic integration, even if we feel culturally more Latin American, in terms of economic integration, there is a balance between those who want to integrate with North America, those who want to integrate with Latin America, and those who think we should integrate with both regions of the world. Now, in terms of going back to the U.S., feelings toward the USA have dramatically become more distrustful in the course of the last years. What you can see is that from 2004 to 2008, those who say that they distrust the U.S. has gone from 43% to 61%. That is an 18 points increase in the public and 20 points increase in the leaders. Probably this is due to the 8 years of the Bush administration and the Bush effect in terms of generating more trust, more distrust, not only of Mexico, but we will see in the second session of today of other Latin American countries vis-a-vis the U.S. And also something that has changed dramatically is that we ask Mexicans whether they would be willing to form one country with the U.S. if that meant a better economic position for them. Only 2 years ago, in 2006, 54% of Mexicans said they would agree strongly, or some would agree, in becoming one country with the U.S. Today, this number is down to 45%. So there's also a 9-point decrease in terms of willingness to integrate with the U.S. So, Robert, this North American community thing is losing speed. And now, in terms of NAFTA and the renegotiation, not only in the U.S. is there space for renegotiation of NAFTA, what you see is that in Mexico, both leaders and the population are also willing for renegotiation of some parts of the agreement, even though Mexico would lose some of its benefits. And if you see in the case of the leaders, it goes from 60% to all the way to 70%. In the case of the population, from 52% all the way to 68%. So again, it's a dramatic increase in terms of those institutionalization agreements of North American integration. However, Mexicans are willing to cooperate with the U.S. in a very pragmatic way, specifically in those areas which are related to security. And Mexicans are pragmatic. You can see an almost majority of the population and a vast majority of the leaders are willing to cooperate with the United States, and specifically in areas of security. For example, if we are willing to accept aid from the U.S. to fight drug trafficking and organized crime, the Merida Initiative, you can see the 55% of the population and 70% of the leaders are willing to accept this economic help. And also, there's a huge support for extradition of Mexicans to the U.S. If you sum the strongly agree to somewhat agree, we're all the way to 75%, 80% of both leaders and the general population. And also, however, what we see is that in general terms, when you ask Mexicans whether they think that being the neighbor of the U.S. is more a problem or an advantage, you see that there's a decreasing perception in terms of being an advantage. And there is an interesting reduction from approximately 52 to 45% amongst the population, and from leaders all the way from 85% to less than 70% of being more a problem than an advantage, being U.S. neighbors. And finally, even if we are pragmatic in terms of cooperation, in terms of security, there are some areas in which Mexican nationalism is still there and difficult to change. For example, energy cooperation in exchange for a migration reform in the U.S. If you ask Mexicans if they would be willing to permit investment in Pemex or in oil, electricity, and gas, and in exchange for that, the U.S. would give, I know that this would never happen, but the U.S. would give a migration reform, still, less than 40% of Mexicans would accept this deal. Still, Mexicans believe that Pemex is only for the Mexicans. And in terms of our part of migration, what should Mexico do? Mexicans haven't decided what the Mexican state should do. And as you well know, the Mexican state hasn't decided yet what it should do regarding immigration. And if you ask them what Mexico should do, some say that they should more Mexicans about the risks. Some say that we should patrol high-risk points to prevent Mexicans from trying to cross. And some others say that we should establish controls along the border to only permit crossing through authorized points. But as you can see, we are divided one-third, one-third, one-third approximately in those issues regarding migration. And also, there's a huge misperception regarding migration. If you ask Mexicans whether they think that U.S. officials treat Mexicans better or Mexicans treat Central American migrants better, you will see that more than 70% of Mexicans think that we Mexicans treat Central American migrants better than U.S. authorities treat Mexican migrants. As you can see, there's a huge misperception on the way we are treating migrants and our nationals are being treated here in the U.S. And finally, lots of people are willing to migrate out of Mexico. I'm sorry, I'm already due time. I will take one more minute. One-third would migrate, and majoritarianly to the United States, as you can see. And what's interesting here is who would migrate. If you see in terms of education, incredibly enough, those who are willing to migrate outside of Mexico are not the poor, are not the less educated ones. On the contrary, the higher your education level, the more willingness you have to migrate outside from Mexico. And also what we see is in terms of age. The younger you are, twice as much young Mexicans would like to migrate outside of the country, as we saw mostly to the United States, than those who are older. So, just to conclude, we have many Mexicos. And the gaps between our different Mexicos are increasing, they're broadening. We see that there is an increasing gap between what leaders think and what the general population thinks. We see a greater gap between what the North thinks and what the South of the country thinks. We also see an increasing gap between age and education. Young people and more educated people are more international, are more willing to migrate, are more willing to accept free trade, are more willing. They're more modern than older, less educated people. And finally, I didn't have the time to discuss this, but there's also an increasing gap between leaders, those which are traditional leaders and those who are emerging leaders, and this will be treated in the presentation in this afternoon. We also think that there's pessimism, self-introspection, and reduced contact with the world of the Mexican population as a whole. However, this goes hand in hand with reduced enthusiasm about North American integration, and specifically with the United States. We should remember that this survey was done before the Obama election, so things might change dramatically when we do the survey next year. And if we see that the world's not working, if we see that there is a reduced enthusiasm for North American integration, we see Latin America as a possible option. We are optimistic about higher and more important integration with Latin America. However, Mexico doesn't have a clear strategy on how to integrate with Latin America. And finally, international threats and foreign policy priorities are centered on social issues. Those international security traditional issues, as you see, were at the middle of the table. Those areas like global warming, AIDS, etc., are the most important threats and therefore priorities of Mexican foreign policy. Thank you, and it was a huge pleasure doing this presentation.
Jorge, let me commend you because you summarized the report in 20 minutes and
22.
or 22 minutes. And to those in the audience, let me just tell you that the report truly is fascinating. And even though Jorge did, I think, an incredible job in summarizing it in 22 minutes, it is worth reading. I think I learned a lot from it. Now we're going to pass to Robert Pastor to comment. Bob is co-director of the American University Center for North American Studies and the Center for Democracy and Election Management. If anybody thinks of North America in either of the three countries, they usually think of Bob, who has always thought of North America and looked at North American integration as a policy option. And Bob, I'm curious to see your comments on this fine report. It's up to you. Yeah, I think 15, 20 minutes. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Armand. Thank you especially CIDE and Jorge for the presentation, and Guadalupe for supervising this overall process. Mae West, who is a favorite of many people, once said that you can never have too much of a good thing. And I sort of feel like that about CIDE's public opinion survey, so I'm delighted and appreciate the opportunity to comment on the survey. I think the thesis you've heard very clearly from Jorge is that Mexico is turning inward, that it's disillusioned with North America, and it's increasingly distrustful of the United States. But there's a problem with the data, and the problem was singled out very neatly by Jorge in his last comment, which is the timing of the data. The timing in which the polls were taken were in August and September. I think if many of those questions were asked in the United States, perhaps even in Canada at the same time, you would actually see a very similar response. And indeed, when CIDE does such a great job in slicing through different concepts of Mexican nationalism, the sharper they slice, the more it looks as if you're asking questions of the United States as much as Mexico. You recall just when he summarized very briefly about Mexican views about dual nationals running for office in Mexico. You can only think about how open the United States is to international ideas, and yet when Japan tried to buy Rockefeller Center, when the Arab Emirates tried to buy the ports in the United States, we reacted like Mexico historically had reacted. So there is a certain mirror there. I think what's missing, and which Jorge and Guadalupe have tried to incorporate a bit in their presentation, and which I will try to do right now, is to place this particular poll in more of a historical and more of a comparative context. They took us back to 2006, but they've also did a poll in 2004, and of course there have been a lot of polls since then. And in placing it in a comparative context, it's very useful to go back again to Guadalupe's first question, which is who speaks for Mexico, who speaks for Latin America? For the longest period of time, we had allowed intellectuals with their own particular bias to speak for Mexico. And Mexican intellectuals were trying to define their sense of nationalism largely in opposition to the United States. So not surprisingly, when you asked Mexican intellectuals their view of the United States, it often sounded anti-American. It's only when we started asking the people in these public opinion surveys that you could begin to realize that Mexican views of the United States were far more sophisticated than we're hearing from the more sophisticated intellectuals. And indeed, the first people who started to ask those questions of large numbers of the with huge samples was Carlos Salinas after he came into office. And to his surprise, he discovered there wasn't the anti-Americanism that was classically defined by the PRI. Indeed, there might be an eagerness to embrace the United States with the North American Free Trade Agreement, which ultimately emerged. And I think he was absolutely right. So you need to place this in broader context and realize that three things have happened since August, September. You've seen the accentuation of the economic crisis in August and September. While there is some sense in the polls of an uneasiness economically, there was also a sense in Mexico as well as in Canada that this was special to the U.S., that because Mexico had behaved so responsibly from a fiscal standpoint with a surplus on trade and a surplus on its fiscal deficit, on its fiscal management, that the economic crisis in the United States would not spill over. Now it's clear that it will and has already in a significant way. Secondly, the concern about drug trafficking, which already is the highest threat in this public opinion poll. My guess is that if you ask it again, it would be even higher than that. But the third change is what Jorge mentioned. It's the election of Obama. Because while the poll does not ask explicitly, and I wish that it would from now on, what Mexico views are of the U.S. as opposed to the incumbent administration performance, I think other polls indicate clearly that the unfavorable views of the United States began right after 9/11 and were very clearly linked to views of George Bush. And as such, of course, this very sharp decline in favorable views of the United States, which we saw steepest in August and September of this year when the poll was taken, actually coincided with views of Americans towards George Bush. And indeed, the election largely turned on those attitudes. So I would hope in future polls we distinguish, because I believe that Mexicans, to a lesser extent Americans, and to perhaps the same extent for Canadians, do make that distinction between the incumbent in power, between the performance and policies of the incumbent as it affects their country, and their view of the nation as a whole. I think the view of the nation as a whole is far more sophisticated than we give credit to the public. So I think first, with regard to Mexican views of the United States, I think what is interesting is not this negative view of the United States, but that it was part of a secular decline that began in 2001, in part because actually expectations of George W. Bush were very high. And in that, there is an important lesson for the Obama administration as well, because I think expectations may be unrealistically high with regard to Obama, too, as it relates to Mexico. And I'll come back to that in a moment. I think the majority of Mexicans still consider the U.S. a partner but not a friend. I'm not sure the distinction is that important in the long term, although it may look important there. Let me move to North America, because obviously Armand has already explained that I try to look at things from a North American standpoint, though I acknowledge, as the Mexicans acknowledge, a certain amount of frustration. And I think the Mexican frustration is not really disenchantment so much as it's frustration. That is to say, it is quite practical and quite pragmatic. And indeed, that is a thread that runs right through this poll. And it's pragmatic because it realizes that no one else, except for Mexico in the last 6-7 years, have been working on North America. The U.S. administration under George W. Bush was simply didn't define its policy in terms of North America, despite the Security and Prosperity Partnership, which I actually believe was counterproductive, because by bringing the only constituents to the table who were CEOs of the three countries, it provoked suspicion that something was going on when in fact actually very little was going on. And so we got the worst of both worlds. No results except in crowing suspicion by the two extremes that began to dominate the debate. Indeed, the most interesting conclusion I would draw, and I'll get into this in a moment, on the views on North America is that there is a North American perspective still very strong, surprisingly strong in Mexico, and indeed also evident in Canada and the United States, despite the fact that Lou Dobbs has defined this debate. George W. Bush was absent, and Barack Obama is not yet present. Despite the fact that there is no leadership on North America at all in the United States, there is a North American view. In fact, I would dispute one of the conclusions in the poll that says that Mexicans are turning increasingly to Latin America rather than to North America. I think, in fact, the numbers are reasonably close, and except in terms of cultural identity. But even then, if you look at the poll, it says that 28% of the public and 23% of the leaders think more in terms of North America than in Latin America. And if you add another 6 and 8%, which view both North America and Latin America as part of their identity, it takes it up to 34%. 1/3 of the Mexican people think North American. Now, this actually reflects an increase over the 2006 poll, in which 62%, only 7% of the public and 11% of the leaders saw themselves as North American. Now, I think that poll was a bit wrong, because there are other polls that are taken at the time that suggest that, in effect, the 1/3 thinking North American from a Mexican perspective is the more accurate one. And again, if you look at similar questions that have been asked in the last few years in the United States and Canada, 31% of Canadians. Oh, well, let me step back. I think they're also asking the wrong question. And I think there's something to be learned from the Eurobarometer on that. The Europeans used to ask the question, do you think of yourself as French or European, German or European? And not surprisingly, the French and the Germans won out. But when they stopped asking that question and started asking the question, do you think of yourself as French and European, German and European, Spanish and European, then the numbers went way up, because it's obviously possible to have a dual identity. Indeed, we all share probably 4 or 5 or 6 different identities. And so we haven't really asked that question specifically, although there are other polls by ECOS in Canada in all 3 countries that have asked that question. And if you merge them together, you will find that 31% of Canadians view themselves as Canadian and North American. 41% of Americans, that is to say in the United States, view themselves as Americans and North American. And roughly 27 to 33%, roughly 1/3 of Mexicans view themselves as Mexican and North American. Now, that is a shocking finding in the opposite direction than what this report suggests. This report suggests that they're disenchanted with North America. I think if 1/3 or more of the population in all 3 countries see this as part of their identity, they are so far ahead of our leaders right now that it's time for the leaders to catch up and to define a North American approach to the 3 countries. Again, it is particularly startling given Lou Dobbs' control of this debate, to the extent to which the Democratic presidential candidates were adopting his statistics on NAFTA rather than better statistics. With regard to future integration, I think it's clear that the Mexicans want it both ways for the time being. And as that is to say, do you want Latin American integration or you want North American integration? And it's roughly 1/3 each, with 1/3 on the fence. Very rational, very pragmatic. You don't want to turn and put all of your eggs in the North American basket if the United States is uninterested or indeed wants to renegotiate NAFTA. The question, do you want to renegotiate NAFTA, bringing it up to 2/3, again, is a very rational and pragmatic response to the Democratic presidential candidates saying, yes, we're going to renegotiate it, and Mexicans are saying, okay, let's talk about agriculture, just as Stephen Harper, when President Obama went up to Ottawa, said, okay, let's talk about oil and the emergency clause in oil, which basically says that Canada, in the face of a crisis, will give positive discrimination to the United States. And if the United States would like us to eliminate this provision, then okay, let's renegotiate NAFTA. I think that the Obama administration has stopped talking about renegotiating NAFTA. They're talking about upgrading the standards, which is a very positive statement because of the real fact that with NAFTA, what's wrong is not what's in it. What's wrong is what is outside of it. That is to say, North America succeeded in beginning to create a North American market, and governance has not kept pace. So all of the major challenges that we face, that we're dealing with right now, have nothing really to do with NAFTA, but they have everything to do with North America. The agenda should change. What are those issues? They're drug trafficking. They're the development gap. One of the most important conclusions coming out of this poll is that there is 2 or 3 Mexicos. Jorge Bustamante wrote right after NAFTA that was his greatest fear, and he was prescient. I would suggest, while you can slice Mexico in 3 ways, as you do very nicely, if you sliced it in 2 ways, North and the South, you'd see even more dramatic change. The North has profited by NAFTA because it's connected to North America. The South is not connected to North America and is speaking a different language than the Zapatistas. The Zapatistas were complaining in 1994 that NAFTA was their problem. The truth is, and this poll underscores it, it's the absence of NAFTA that's the problem for the south of Mexico. NAFTA doesn't connect to Mexico. There is no regional and cohesion fund. There's no North American investment fund that could tie Mexico together and tie the whole thing to North America. And if there were, then I think you'd see a very different statement on this choice of whether you want to face North America or you want to face Latin America. A completely different statement. Finally, with regard to collaboration with countries in North America, again, I think you see a high degree of flexibility, but even more so, I would say, in another poll that was done by ECOS, which focuses on about 10 different functional areas, and asked people in all 3 countries, would you like to see a coordinated, integrated policy on these areas, or a separate and national policy? And the majority, the overwhelming majority of the public in all 3 countries said, we want an integrated policy on the environment, on border security, on transportation, on economic policies, and even on defense policies. And a modest majority, even in Mexico, on energy, immigration. So even in the sensitive issues, the public is saying, let's coordinate. Let's work on a North American approach to these issues rather than a separate national approach. This is not being heard by the leadership in any of the 3 countries, and it's certainly not being articulated. I thought, just a word on the foreign policy issues, it is a dramatic statement of how far Mexico has come in simply since 2000 or 2004 on the degree to which Mexico has become more like the United States in some fashion. That is to say, as Jorge pointed out, that it supports the UN, but not if it means that international law should be more important than national law, which, of course, is not true to the Constitution of either country. Our leaders are not explaining this well to our people. and even President Obama has had to learn this on the trucking issue in the last week or 2 weeks, or rather his people have tried to learn this. I think also with regard to whether or not we should follow UN decisions, even if they don't agree with us. Of course, here Mexicans are saying they agree with George Bush on Iraq, because you recall that George Bush did not follow the UN Security Council, but followed his own interests. So in that sense, there are some similarities, even if they're not of a positive nature, from those of us who do believe that international organizations have a larger role to play, and that international law, by our own constitutions, should be supreme over that of national law. Let me just conclude so that we could hear from all of you and from my colleague. I think the first and most important thing to conclude is about this two countries within Mexico. I think you can see it not just in the public opinion surveys. Much more significant is in economic growth rates. The northern part of Mexico grew 10 times faster than the southern part of Mexico since NAFTA. When you average it out, it indicates that there's been no growth in per capita income in Mexico, and therefore NAFTA has not been very effective. Wrong conclusion. If you disaggregate and you see that that part of Mexico that was connected to North American market grew 10 times faster, the more logical conclusion is that all of Mexico could grow if there was a strategy to integrate the South with the North, such as a North American Investment Fund on transportation and infrastructure. And you could see the discrepancy as well on politics. The northern part of Mexico and the southern part of Mexico are voting in different parties with different constituencies. Now, if you look at the United States, you can also see red and blue states that are appealing to different planets in this country. And despite the president's wish to cross that line and bring bipartisanship into it, as we even saw with the economic recovery plan, that only accrued maybe 2 or 3 senators on the Republican side. So we're dealing with different planets. And I think that the president's effort to try to reach across is a positive effort and something important, but it's going to be very difficult to do so. Mexico's is far more serious because this goes not just to psychological and temperamental views of which policies and philosophical views. It goes to the very economic structure of the country, which is, I would argue, a far greater challenge for the United States and for Canada than it is than the drug trafficking issue, which is the one that's focusing everybody's attention right now. I think, secondly, the truth is that this poll does not reflect a permanent break in Mexican views about the world or about the United States. It in fact reflects a decline and disenchantment based on recent events and based on failures of the governments to address the problems in their proper magnitude. And the proper magnitude says we are part of now an emerging North American market which is ungoverned. The issue is the same at base, what the U.S. is dealing with in terms of the economic crisis. We saw the extension of a financial securities market with no regulation, with no governance. If you let a market grow without any regulation whatsoever, without any sense of the size of that market, it will come back and hit you in the face. And that's what's happening with regard to North America right now, and that's why a new articulation of it is so key. It is very positive that Mexicans now have such a high affinity for Canada, but I think as Mexicans look more closely at Canada, they may be disillusioned with them as well, because they don't seem to be at all interested in Mexico. Will Obama be different? I think there are some good signs in his going to Mexico and Canada and sending his cabinet down there. I think that there are some questionable signs, which is that the new administration is still not organized to do Mexico and Canada any differently than its predecessors. And I would argue that it's the lack of vision and the lack of organization which has led to this decline in Mexican views of both about North America and about the United States, and therefore that is what needs to be changed. Mark Twain once wrote that you should get your facts first, and then you can distort them as much as you please. I think this is not a case of distorted facts. This is a case in this poll of one slide or one frame in a long-running movie, and we have to get the movie right. Thanks.
Okay. Bob, thank you very much. Before we continue on with Francisco, let me just point out, Bob, and I don't know to what extent you saw it, on the Bush, on page 61 and page 62, there is a polling question on ranking leaders in which President Bush ranks even behind Chavez. So you can extrapolate a little bit and see the bias, even though they don't ask throughout the polling to differentiate between country and leadership. That one question, obviously, I think the CIDA does a good job in trying to differentiate whether there is a gap between their view towards the country and the leadership. I just wanted to point that out because I know Jorge.
I meant to say that there's a new axis that was defined there, and that is to say the three least popular leaders in Mexico were Hugo Chavez, Raul Castro, and George W. Bush.
Okay, let's move on to Francisco. Francisco is the Reardon Rowett Assistant Professor of Latin American Studies at the NITSA School at SAIS. He served as a British Academy postdoctoral fellow at the Nuffield College at the University of Oxford. I have a daughter that's about to go to college, and I'm going to be paying tuition. Therefore, I'm very, very glad to see that he received the 2006 SAIS Excellence in Teaching Award. Now that I'm going to be paying tuition, excellence in teaching has all of a sudden assumed a much higher importance for me.
We deliver money for value, or value for money.
Francisco,
thank you, Armand. Thanks for the invitation. I want to start by congratulating the authors of the report and everyone who was involved in making this possible. Its breadth, scope, and rigor is unparalleled. I look forward to in a couple of decades' time, once the data has accumulated, I look forward to hearing about this type of study as much as we hear, say, the World Value Study by Ronald Inglehart, and the rigor of it bodes very well in that direction. I'll make a few short comments. First one regarding the more self-absorbed, pessimistic perspective that Mexicans show. I mean, I think public opinion in Mexico is accurately reflecting problems elsewhere, and the kind of pessimism with globalization that has become increasingly poignant, particularly since the summer of 2007 when the subprime started, means that Mexicans are no different than any other people in today's economy. Also surprised, raised the issue that both Jorge and Bob raised the timing of the survey carried out between August the 14th and September the 6th of 2008. If you remember, the Lehman Brothers collapse occurred on 15th, 16th September, and that's really when the situation went pear-shaped. My sense is that pessimism and self-absorption will, if anything, become worse, and it will continue to get worse rather than better. Of course, related to that issue is the nationalist backlash, and it's happened whenever the world economy goes down. It happened in the 30s, in the 80s during the debt crisis. There were strong sense of nationalism and the return of these young democracies. Some of that early brewing of malaise regarding Washington Consensus, etc. So there, I can also see this nationalist temptation as keeping, being in tune with what one would expect when economic conditions deteriorate. Surprising in a way to see elites being more nationalist, being recalcitrant, for example, when it comes to the opening up of the energy sector, much more than the people. And here the usual opinion, the traditional opinion is, well, it's the people, this very affective and ill-informed perspective of President Cárdenas in the 30s and watching the cinema footing of, rich and poor queuing up outside Palacio Nacional to take their jewels, chickens, eggs, whatever they had to help pay the compensation for the oil companies. So whereas on the one hand that exists and that certainly has retained some echo in Mexican society, I don't find it surprising that it is at the end of the day the elites. In particular, I would have expected intellectuals, government officials to be more recalcitrantly against the opening up of the energy sector, and there I think the bottom line would be that old adage in Mexican politics, no? Vivir fuera del presupuesto es vivir en el error. To live outside the budget, to live outside the possibility to increase your prerogatives is obviously to be stupid. And so from that perspective, what might on one hand seem paradoxical, the elite should be more cosmopolitan, better informed. Well, their interests, I suppose, still remain in the realm of a big state in Mexico. At the end of the day, at least in the 1940s, was very important in creating the urban middle classes, and that continues to be the case. Second, in terms of distrust vis-a-vis the U.S., I agree with Bob that this distrust might have peaked. This distrust might have been the accumulation of the two presidencies of Bush 43, and I would expect that with the changes of government and policies under President Barack Obama, at least there'll be some restoration of confidence regarding the role of the United States in international affairs. More pressing for me would be the growing problem of the economy. The idea that economic integration with the U.S. is not paying off. The fact that our business cycles have converged so much more since the mid-1990s means that here people are expressing a perspective which is rational, which is closely aligned with their wallets, with what's happening with their households' economies. And there, rather than highlighting the regional distinction that Bob made, north versus south, which indeed it does exist, and certainly in terms of capacity for job creation, the north has done much better than the south since 1994. I would highlight more a temporal distinction, whereby between 1994 and around 2000, those first 6 years of NAFTA, the kinds of adjustments that Mexico was forced to incur to open markets, that, if you want, grabbing the low-hanging fruit of integrating with the U.S. paid off quite well. The economy bounced back after the disastrous 94-95 years. And 97 to 99 were years of relatively high growth with inflation under control. After 2000, come the dot-com bust, come 9/11, come the setting on of a pessimism in the U.S., indeed of a recession in the U.S., I'd say that since 2000, NAFTA has not delivered value for money, irrespective of locations. If anything, for example, if we remember during those 2000 to 2003 period, more than 400,000 jobs were lost in northern Mexico. And this has to do with the great elasticity of labor positions in the north. Most of those jobs connected to maquila means that they tend to be very, very flexible in terms of the capacity for producers to respond to changes in demand. And so what from the economist perspective comes across as, hey, that's exactly what we want: economic structures that are nimble and flexible and which allow us to adjust supply and demand as the international cycle moves on. For the workers' perspective, for government officials' perspective, this flexibility, of course, can end up wreaking havoc. And indeed, I think many of the cities in the border in Mexico had a very, very tough time 2000 to 2003, 4. And I don't think that has been reversed. Third, a surprising finding says that Mexican concerns about social issues in the international arena have gained ground compared with traditional concerns such as security and economic competition. Surprising findings, and I don't know what to attribute them to. I don't know if it's the timing of the survey. I would have expected that given the economic bust, issues of economic competition would be high in the agenda both of elites as well as masses, and of course the issue of security. I mean, Jorge showed some numbers regarding clear support both for the Merida Initiative, for things like extraditing drug traffickers to the U.S. So there, my own the paradox for me is, why is it that people in August, September of 2008, when both the issue of the global economic collapse was pre-Lehman Brothers, but already quite bad. Second, the war on drugs having got pretty bad by then. More than 6,000 people killed in 2008 in the drug-related violence. Why it is that people seem to be more interested in, more attached to issues such as world poverty, epidemics, food shortages, and global warming. So that remains a mystery to me. The last point is regarding Asia as an opportunity. I think this is an interesting one. The gap between the public and the elites, again, whereas on the one hand might come across as surprising, with the public having a more positive opinion about China's position in the world, China's capacity to grow at high rates. 46% of Mexicans expressed, if not admiration, they were in favor of that capacity to grow fast. Great contrast regarding the leaders. 60% of them disliked it. And there, my own perspective would be, on the one hand, I think the public might be trying to engage in some wishful thinking. I mean, if China is doing, if another South developing country is doing it, why is it that we cannot do it? Why is it that the types of rates of growth, 6-7% that Mexico actually was able to have between the 1940s and the late 1960s have just evaporated and have never come back? I think there's an issue of expectations there that Bob touched upon. Maybe at the time that NAFTA was sold, we were expecting to be able to make it to the first world without undergoing any tough transition. Close to 15 years on, I think that many of those expectations have just been let down. On the other hand, I do find, how can I put it? I think that the rationale for elites in Mexico being a bit more distrustful, a bit more concerned regarding China's rise is can be squarely placed on the idea that Mexico has definitely lost market shares in textile and apparels, in basic electronics, our own so-called Silicon Valley around Guadalajara. Indeed, auto parts. All these areas are parts in which China, since joining the WTO in 2001, has pushed aggressively into the U.S. In those three sectors, at least, Mexico has lost market share vis-a-vis the Chinese. And unfortunately, unlike Brazil, which has a very healthy diversified trade profile, and if one of its engines of growth, say the U.S., is on its knees, it can still rely, say, on Asia, on South America, and on Europe, because they trade a lot with all of those countries and regions. Mexico, unfortunately, as you know, more than 80% of our exports are tied to the U.S. markets, and equally so when it comes to imports. So any competition for the U.S. market can easily hurt us. I think I understand elites' concerns there. Interesting to see all those unfulfilled expectations of the public, and the public seeing a system such as China's, which politically is authoritarian, is repressive, nonetheless as an interesting alternative when it comes to delivering, a modicum of standard of living for its population. I think I've gone on for a long time, and I'm very sorry that I have to leave. I'm already late for my Monday class at 10:15. I feel bad because it's my colleagues who are going to have to field the questions, but it's been a pleasure being here with all of you. Thank you so much.
Francisco, thank you very much. I think we have a couple of minutes. I don't know if we can take a couple of questions from the audience. I don't know if there's any questions, the gentleman.
Is there a way in the way the statistics are collected to be able to tell us?
And if you can please identify yourself as well.
Eduardo Feller, former National Science Foundation. Is there a way in the way those statistics are collected in the survey to tell something about the perceptions, the coloring of the perceptions about the U.S. having to do with a proportion of the Mexican population that is migrated to the U.S. but that is still economically tied to Mexico and the health of the Mexican economy through remissions?
Why don't we take a couple questions?
Yeah, why don't we take a couple of questions and then we can...
Brief questions, because we have, I think, a few minutes left. I think in the back.
My name is Jessica Esquivel Alonso. I am a student for Washington Center, and according with your comments, my question is, what do you think about the legal reform in Mexico? Because I guess the legal reform involves more than likes and dislikes. Nowadays, the principal factor is legitimación. In other words, that the new law is going to be represent Mexicans' concern.
Okay, let's leave it at the two questions because of time constraints.
No, I don't. Why don't you take the second
Okay,
one?
let me answer the first one. The good thing about the survey is that not only do we have the 69 questions, we have, I think it's 16 socio-demographic questions. Therefore, and the whole database is publicly available at our website, which is mexicoyelmundo.cide.edu. We'll put it right here so you can copy it. And the nice thing is that we have questions regarding people who are receiving remittances, people who have a family member living in the U.S. or somewhere around the world, and also a family member from that family unit living in the world. Therefore, you can cross the information and know specifically the gender, the age, the education, the political party affiliation, whether they have relatives in the U.S. or not, whether they receive remittances or not, and then see what they think about the U.S., what they think about Latin America, what they think about foreign policy. Therefore, that is the great advantage of this survey. The raw data is available for everyone to play with it as much as they can, and we would highly appreciate that everyone in the room looks at the data, and those who are writing dissertations decide to write your dissertation on the survey, and those who want to conduct research use all this data for your own personal consumption. So yes, the data is so rich, you can do almost anything you want with it.
Let me address both the legal reform and the remittance question in a broader context. First, on legal reform, I think the steps were very important, but there is a gradual transition by which they move from one legal system to another legal system, which will take a fair amount of time and will not show, I believe, results for a while. But I think it's a positive step. On remittances, Last year, the remittances level were as high as $24-25 billion, which is very significant. For a long period of time, indeed, I myself believe when I first wrote on this subject more than 25 years ago and proposed a remittance bank, it was felt that these remittances could also not only help families but help develop certain areas of the country from which the immigrants were leaving. I think that's a flawed idea based on a faulty premise. Remittances should be thought of not as potential sources of investment. They are aid to dependent families. They are welfare payments. And as such, anywhere from 90 to 93% of those remittances are used for pure consumption by dependent families. And what they do is they keep a stagnating community stagnating, but at least surviving. And so they are not sufficient to deal with the development issue. And of course, remittances will decline this year because not only are some migrants returning, but many migrants are being laid off in the United States. They have less to send back. In the poll, there is a suggestion that as many as 70% of the Mexican population have not traveled abroad, and that this was a sign of the lack of internationalism. I think previous surveys showed a much more compelling idea, and that was that perhaps as many as half of all Mexicans have a relative living in the United States. And indeed, it was that interconnectedness that I think Salinas first understood when he proposed a free trade agreement with the U.S., because he realized that those people had a different view about the United States. And I think that's a much more compelling idea. Let me just say one other point about what Francisco said, which I want to underscore because I think it's a very important and a very powerful point that has not been understood. And that is that not only are the Mexicans correct in concluding that integration has not paid off since 2001, but it is factually correct that the growth in integration between 1993 and 94 and 2000 was astonishing among the three countries of North America. We went in a relatively short period of time to being somewhat unconnected economies and societies to becoming almost as connected as Europe after 5 decades of integration. If you take just one indicator of regional integration, which is intra-regional trade as a percentage of global trade, we went from 1980s from 40% of our trade with the world by the three countries was with ourselves to 57% by the year 2000. In Europe, it's 61%. So that degree of economic integration is enormous. Now, of course, the degree of dependence of Mexico and Canada on the U.S. market was up to 80%. But significant from the U.S. standpoint, we were more than 1/3 of our trade with the world is with our two neighbors. 36% of all of our trade is with our two neighbors. And the largest source of energy, et cetera, and of course the impact on migration. So in that short period from 93 to 2000, there was a rapid payoff in integration, and it stopped. It went flat or declined since then. And indeed, since 2001, the number of people crossing the borders have declined significantly, largely because of security restrictions that serve no other purpose but to harass people on the border and to increase the cost of commerce. The increased cost of commerce is much larger, almost twice what the tariffs on NAFTA that were eliminated. And that, therefore, what we've seen, integration has trailed off since 2000 because the lack of attention on the part of our governments to what was going on, China's involvement, obviously, in WTO, but more significantly, the security restrictions and others have put a burden, not just trucking, but broader than that, on our three economies in a way that has significantly hurt our three economies in ways that are understood better in Canada and in Mexico than in the United States, but really have had a sizable impact on the U.S. as well.
Okay, with that, I think I'd like to conclude the event. I know we have another event, another speaker coming right now. Let me just close by saying this. I think that the the report underscores how I think Mexicans don't necessarily appreciate how strategic the relationship is with the United States. I think, and that's the same can be said of Americans, and I think to a lesser extent the same thing can be said of Canadians. I'm astonished at the fact that so many Mexicans see themselves as Latin Americans and not as North Americans when you consider the remittances levels. You consider the fact that there are 6.5, at the very least, undocumented Mexican nationals residing in this country. The fact that Hispanics in the United States are rising at such fast rates. Trade. And yet, Mexicans, both leaders and the American public, still see themselves as Latin Americans. Anyway, I thought that was interesting. Jorge and Guadalupe, I think you guys did a great job on the report. The only thing I regret is that there isn't such a report for Americans and for Canadians, which would be great to see. But anyway, thank you very much. Please join me in thanking Jorge, Bob, and Francisco.